Hello everyone, welcome to the Malgus-RP Podcast. My name is Iradox, and with me today is my co-host Hirak.
Hello there.
So, Hirak, it's been a while since our last episode.
It has been.
How long? Like 2 months?
Yeah, something like that. It's been quite a while.
So what have you been up to in that while?
Well, I've been quite busy actually. I've got 2 wonderful apprentices. I've been busying myself with some, classic Master Apprentice roleplay. A lot of intrigue going on in the guild. It's been really fun actually. Just been, casually doing that.
Wonderful Sith apprentices. That sounds like you should really watch your back.
I mean, I should do, but I feel like I've trained them to the point where they really respect me.
Ooh, but is that the point of Sith apprentices?
No, of course not.
Oh well, it depends. Darth Bane wouldn't agree, but in this era...
Exactly.
It depends. Apprentices are a bit more resources.
Yeah, they're just assets.
Well, I've been pretty busy myself, actually. I haven't been playing that much Photo as of late, the last couple of weeks, actually. Sort of stepped down from actively guild leading after 3 years.
Wow, how come?
Oh, it's just... It's a lot of pressure leading a guild, you feel like you constantly have to provide stuff. So I sort of stopped leading one guild, then I tried a different concept, but it didn't really fly as well as the last one. So now I'm just sort of leading a smaller, tighter, role-playing group together with friends, where I play my main character, Iradox.
Awesome.
Yeah. Without, the pressure to always provide something. It's more like slice of life RP, and people are capable of providing their own roleplay. And then we do events when it makes sense, and so on.
That's always a positive.
And then I've been sinning a bit. I've been playing a bit of World of Warcraft too.
I can't talk. I do the same.
Yeah, I know. Anyway, the topic of today is a pretty intense one. It's character deaths.
No.
Oh, yes.
That topic.
Yeah, that topic. And I know we've both had some close encounters with this concept.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a pretty controversial one. Do you want to explain to our listeners why it's a controversial topic?
It's a controversial topic because we grow attached to our characters. It is something that affects a lot of the time for most people, both an IC and an OC line in a way. Some people are able to separate themselves from it, some people aren't, and that's why it causes such drama, because it affects people in different ways. Some people could just watch their characters die, have no issues whatsoever, whereas some people will essentially, bawl out in tears. It's something that causes a lot of grief, and a lot of times some people will try and just do it without permission. There's lots of essentially bad ways to do it, but there's also a lot of good ones. So it's a really confusing and tough topic to talk about.
Well, it's pretty interesting there, because you mentioned permission to kill somebody else's character, which is not necessarily something that goes across all RP mediums. For instance, in Dungeons and Dragons, the game master wouldn't, for those uninitiated, like Dungeons and Dragons, sitting around a table throwing dice, and with one game master who tells the story. In that setting, the game master wouldn't have to ask permission for killing a character. But we usually expect that our fellow role players ask our permission out of character before trying to kill the character of another role player in an MMO, which from an outsider perspective, or from a new role player's perspective, this might seem a bit contradictory, considering that it's preached that you should always keep in character and out of character separate. Could you explain why this isn't necessarily the case with character deaths?
It's it's in the Star Wars, in our role players as it is right now.
It's just an MMO role playing in general.
I think a major difference. I like the example about Dungeons and Dragons because it's very true. In that setting, the GMs are the gods. They are the rule. They set the limits and how far things can go. In an MMO situation, we are presented where everyone has a sort of controlling aspect of their character. It's hard to be a character in this world and try and essentially determine something else with someone else's character like a GM would. We don't have that. That doesn't exist. We're like playing Dungeons and Dragons without the GM. It's almost like you kind of have to be a democracy and be very empathetic with another person. It's hard to kind of force that on someone else in that way.
Yes, and I also think there is the aspect that not only isn't there a game master to make the final decision, it's also that in a Dungeons and Dragons setting, the role-playing is sort of centralized around the game master creating the world. So you only really have an opportunity to role-play this character when you have a game master who reacts, and creates the world around you. Whereas in our role-playing setting, your character can have a daily life and get to know other role players, and there isn't really as you said, a god setting the rules to the same degree.
Yeah, it's it requires a level of etiquette. I think that is that is very important. In the same way, it kind of goes with mentioning other people's characters. In the same way that in a moat fighting, one must always respect that the defender has the choice of what happens to their character. It's about finding ways around that, and it does require a good amount of communication.
Well, yes, to a degree. Sometimes you can also sort of, if you defend yourself against an impossible blow, it could be perceived as guard emoting, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it could be. Common sense. Common sense, people.
But I don't know. Have you ever played Dungeons and Dragons, or do you play Dungeons and Dragons? I
don't play Dungeons and Dragons, but I play currently Dark Heresy, and I also play one of the Star Wars ones. All I can think about is the Discord name, but it's Edge of the Empire. I think we call it Edging the Empire, but.
So you have experience with tabletop role playing?
Yeah, it's over Discord, but
would you say that the attachment level, because we spoke of emotional attachments before, that it's different with characters that you role play over like a table in Dungeons and Dragons or things you mentioned, and role playing characters in MMO?
It's a difficult one, really, because I think time makes the difference. We play once every week or so, but I'm on Hirak, playing him almost every single day, and I've played him for over a year now. The attachment there for a character's story does exist, and it's definitely more so with Hirak than there is any of the other tabletop characters that I play. Although I find them amusing and I like their story, I do find myself drawn to that. I think it's more difficult because I don't have that avatar in front of me. I don't see how others react to him. The randomness of everything is scripted by a GM to a certain extent. So I don't fall in love with those interactions that one gets. It's a difficult thing. I definitely say I'd care more about the actual avatar because, people get artwork about them as well. I've never had artwork done on my tabletop characters.
Well, I do know some people who've had artwork made of their tabletop characters that they have been role playing for many years, but I have to say, in my personal experience, I also think that it's a case of growing more attached because I think people generally spend more time with their characters in a MMO role play on a daily basis.
Yeah, for certain. It's definitely a time thing.
Yeah, but you also mentioned RP antiquity, and I'm thinking maybe we could delve a bit more into this topic in regards to character deaths.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because we already did a bit. We had this talk about if somebody tries to injure your character, you have the last say in it. And I sort of engaged you a bit and said, is that necessarily true? Because in that case, I think we're both Civ role players and we both played Civ for a while. And therefore, I think we've both been in a situation where our characters role played with some other Civ character who when our characters did something to them, or somebody else's character did something that could have a negative repercussion to them, they dodged without there really being a logical solution that would enable them to do so. For instance, if they were trapped in a corner and they were coming, lightsabers from all sides, something like that, but they magically dodge. Because they feel entitled to determine what happens to their character, which then ruins the fun and takes out the immersion from the others. So where do you think that line sort of lies?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, because it actually really depends on the stance of the community you're in. So, for example, there will be a community somewhere on our server that believes, that character death is just something that's very taboo and shouldn't be done. Whereas in the community...
But we weren't talking about character deaths now, we were just talking about injuries.
Oh, yeah, the injuries. Sorry. Yeah, exactly. They're those sort of things, injuries, etc., who believe that, that those should be avoided at all costs. The etiquette in there is that that doesn't exist, or something like that, for example. Whereas if you take, for example, the community that I sort of started in, very much believed in, character death or injury can happen at any time, without consent, as long as it makes realistic sense. So the example of realism versus storytelling, if it would be an awesome story of him to get out, realism of it, there's multiple people coming in from all sides, as you said, with lightsabers drawn, that character dies there, and that's the sort of thing that you grow up in, or at least your character has kind of grown through, and from that determines their actions, determines how things go. And I think the etiquette in that situation is completely different from both sides, and it's when those two communities sort of collide, that's where I see the line being an issue. And it's hard to define that because of the varying spectrums.
As a general rule, I'd say that I've observed that people tend to treat injuries and character harm on a scale. For instance, you have like a bruise or something, which is not really something you usually need to ask permission for, and it's usually like a consequence that most decent RPGs will accept without much complaint if they feel it makes sense within the context of the roleplay they're having. And then you have like maiming that might put people off, and then because it will have a very large impact on their character. And then at the end, you have like character death that completely finishes your character story, at least unless you include something like holocrons or force ghosts, which means that often a lot of people are not comfortable with the concept of character deaths. In fact, we have there's a mod or an add-on in the Warcraft roleplay that allows you to sort of set so that other roleplayers can see, do you accept character deaths? And then you can pick like, no, not under any circumstances, and then you can pick with consent, and then you can just pick yes.
Yeah.
Which I think is pretty representative for how roleplayers in Tor also seem to perceive it from what I've encountered.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think that is perceived. We don't have an add-on, unfortunately, as much as that would be so cool to have those sort of similar add-ons on Star Wars. We unfortunately don't have it. It's one of those situations where you just got to ask, whisper someone, communication. That's the main thing.
Yeah, and you also mentioned character story. And in my experience, you tend to sort of have three kind of role players when it comes to character death and story. There are the people who on one side really roleplay their characters, roleplay as like a story with a beginning, middle, and end. And the end tend to be when they say the end is, when they feel it's meaningful for their characters to die or to retire or something like that. Then on the other hand, you have the very happenstance realism role players who tend to sort of just totally go with the flow. So they'll kill off their characters if it makes sense, if they feel it makes sense. And then you have people who tend to sort of hover around the middle. And usually, in my experience, conflict happens when one party on either end sort of assumes too much.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. It's that sort of disgruntled miscommunication. I think that kind of, or lack of, I think being the better term here, when that sort of essentially bubble explodes and things move from an IC platform onto an OOC platform, that is when I think it all just starts to get worse. Like you said, there's three kinds of people, and I think as long as you're open and flexible and able to work around a situation, at the end of the day, it's just a video game. Don't have to feel as if you're forced into a situation, but don't make the rookie mistake of thinking that consequences don't exist, because they do, and that's part of storytelling.
Okay, well, maybe we could set up a sort of example to see how we would handle it. So, right now, you're your character, Lord Sanguinus, right?
Yeah.
Hirak. Okay, you're Lord Sanguinus, and we're going to say you have a sister. I don't know whether your character has a sister, but your character really likes his sister, okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, I realize that probably doesn't fit with your character.
No, it's a cracking example. No, it's a cracking example.
Okay. Well, I am this new, relatively new Sith apprentice now, who is plotting against you. And I've decided that in order to get to you, it's a really smashing idea to threaten your sister. So I try and kidnap her. Unfortunately, you catch me in the act, and I try to kill her. It doesn't quite work, but now I'm faced with you. You're a Sith Lord, I'm a new sort of apprentice, and we're gonna fight. I'm gonna lose. I do lose. And in this case, what would your character do? Realistically, without restraints.
Realistically, without restraints, Hirak would just kill.
Okay, so say, how would you then handle that situation?
In my honest...
As a player.
Yeah, of course. In as a player in that situation, if the other guy has attempted character death with the other player, for example, whoever's playing my sister, if they had an agreement that they both accepted character death, I'd assume that as soon as I came in, such an agreement also exists, because everyone has accepted it in that environment, and I'd whisper them to make sure that that was the case. If that wasn't the case, and it was just they had, the guy's going to attempt to kill the sister, but obviously it fails because neither of them accept character death, I would not enforce it upon them. An example of this would be Clone Wars Episode 2. Dooku, doesn't end up killing either Obi-Wan Kenobi or Anakin, despite grievous bodily harm. To take down Obi-Wan, it's like a couple of shim strikes. That's what I'd essentially restrict it to, because I'm not, especially someone that's not in my own community, I'm not going to enforce something upon someone that it wouldn't, that they don't want to. For me, the communication would have to be a whisper conversation to determine what was the stance of it all, especially if I hadn't been brought in from the beginning. If I had been and it was all agreed, then as long as there's no drama and everyone's happy about the situation, I'll go where it would be.
Okay, so essentially you'd whisper him and ask and sort of get these things established before you go through.
Yeah.
And what if he said, I'm actually not cool with character death?
Then the character wouldn't die, but then I think none of the characters in that situation can die. It can't be only for him. It has to essentially be a mutual situation. It has to extend to everyone in that environment. One of the things that I think is important, and it's something that especially in my community we use, is called escalation, where it essentially makes sense. If there's no sort of prior role play that sort of essentially shows that and a sudden escalation of death doesn't make sense, then it doesn't. And I think that's the key thing to think about, at least in this situation, if they're up for it. Otherwise, I wouldn't. It has to be a mutual thing, is my summary, I suppose.
So communication is key.
Yeah.
And if you can sort of establish you have a level playing ground, that's the ideal. That's what I hear you saying.
Yeah, that's the most important thing for me, at least, that everyone has fun.
Okay, well then let's reverse the situation here. Lord Hirak is now at the Nexus Cantina, and suddenly Darth something comes in, and he's very angry at Lord Sanguinus, not Lord Hirak. He's very angry at your character, and he scowls at you because you're an alien. He doesn't like aliens. And your character, for some reason, maybe it's the way he looks, Or maybe, you know, he's just unfortunate, but this Darth decides he's gonna try and kill you. And without any OC warning or anything, he tries to do just that. Mm-hmm. What happens then?
For me, I am very much of the mind that, you know, I'm very much key on escalation and prior warning. If there is some serious, you know, competent amount of escalation, then I will, you know, accept that there are attempts there. For me, I wouldn't want to break the icy immersion of that situation, but I would whisper the guy and say, hey, look, you know, this is, you just come out of nowhere really with this. I'm all okay if you want to whisper me and set up something like that, but I prefer a bit of prior interaction first, at least on an OOC level playing field, so I understand that this is your intent here. At the end of the day, I think my mindset is they can try, which is always something I picked up from a friend of mine. But in that sort of situation, I'd still say communication is important. I personally don't agree with suddenly forcing it upon someone, but I do understand that in an IC situation, you know, go with the flow. I find a resolution through it, but I wouldn't want to stop the role play, especially if it's in a public place. If it's, you know, a private thing, you can talk about it for a little while. But, you know, in that sort of situation, I'd still want to whisper them and make sure that there's a level playing field.
So communication here again. What about like long-term schemings to kill a character? Is that, let me phrase that differently. Do you think that's okay to start scheming, like starting an elaborate scheme to kill another character without, you know, asking them first, out of character?
I think it's best to be on a level playing field. An example of this, for me at least, whilst I realise it is talking about my character in this situation, was Zarius. When our characters were finally punished severely, myself and Trakton, his colleague, we actually asked the player character on the day that we started scheming. We said, do you accept character death? And he said, yes. Do you? And we said, yes. And from that point onwards, we obviously schemed, and that was very much an open situation, and it ended with us surviving, which was great. You know, and it led to some really, really fantastic roleplay. You know, although stressful, it was really, really fun. And I think it was made positive by the fact that we all knew where we stood at this point. The stakes were high.
But in this case, it was about somebody who hadn't contacted you, because we've already established that it's totally fine if you establish you on the same playing field. But what if somebody just did that without letting you know beforehand? Not necessarily even somebody in your guild, just some other person, other role player, you know.
I'd still message them. The thing is, I suppose it depends on whether it makes sense or not. Like, if my character had really messed up, then it makes sense in that situation. Then for me, that's okay. It's I'd still feel a little bit sort of annoyed OOC'ly in the sense that nobody had actually contacted me to kind of deal with this. But with realism and how things that work, I believe, you know, as long as it makes sense and it's not just the most ridiculous plot ever, that was just completely outlandish and just wouldn't make sense in a situation, you know, then I'd be perfectly fine with it. It just, I still think communication is key. I'd still want to talk to them and figure out what's going on. But as long as it was explained to me and it all makes sense, then I'm happy to roleplay it. I'm not massively keen, about randomly voiding things, but I am keen about that communication there. I still think it's key.
So you're saying, what I'm hearing you say sounds a bit conflicted to me. On one hand, you think it's fine as long as they communicate with you at some point, but on the other hand, you'd prefer if they communicated with you right away.
Yeah, the thing is, though, I'm very flexible. I don't mind in the situation. I think it's more polite to contact someone if you are deciding to take them down there, because if you are essentially affecting someone else's character. I also get that you don't, if you don't want their characters to be aware, or them to be aware of a situation like that, you might not want to tell them, and that's fair. I get that. I just think at some point there needs to be some communication, because it's the honest and polite thing to do to someone. But I'm happy to take it as it comes in an icy situation.
So it sounds like you're a bit more in the end of the things happen side, realism side.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm probably more on the story end. I think it's incredibly rude if people don't contact you about something like that first, because you enter another person's story when they have stories going on with a lot of other people and so on. So unless you've agreed on the premise first, I think it's generally very rude and shouldn't be done.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is also one of the reasons I think it's very important to communicate first. For instance, if I want to kill somebody's character or scheme against them in a way that could impact them significantly in that way, whom isn't somebody I'd known already and established a common premise with, I would always contact them first. Which in my experience is also what tends to work best. The times I've seen something like this, it's usually where somebody's gone and done that without informing the other party and without having common reference of rules. It's usually not turned out well. We probably just need to look a couple of years back at all the drama that took place on Korriban with the different academy projects to see that.
Yeah, I sadly wasn't around for that, so I wouldn't know much, but I have heard stories.
But let's move on then, because when character deaths are involved, or character death attempts, you also mentioned avoiding roleplay, and that you'd rather avoid it. But to give a brief overview, avoiding roleplay is generally when somebody who's been in roleplay decides out of character that didn't happen. Like the roleplay they partook in didn't happen. Which role players do on occasion. You've probably encountered it. I certainly have. Usually the consent tends to be that it's not really okay. But in a case of character deaths, for instance, where somebody has tried to suddenly jump your character or lures them into a situation without your consent and then tries to kill them, do you think it's okay to avoid such roleplay?
In my honest opinion, I think that in certain situations it's not okay. But if, for example, some random PvE came up to me on Korriban, leapt in with a 2-line emote saying "I jump in and kill your character," then obviously in that situation,
I don't even think that's legit, because I don't think any roleplayer would really take that seriously.
No, of course not. But I definitely avoid that.
I'm talking more in the sense of that Darth trying to kill you in the cantina, or that unknown role player without asking you suddenly showing up with his 5 buddies and deciding that you're going to die now.
In my opinion, I'm not a massive fan of avoiding roleplay. I'd much rather hash it out in the spot, as it were. Unless it's a situation where it really, really doesn't make sense, and I completely agree that it doesn't make sense, then that is the only time that I'm happy to avoid roleplay. For example, there was a case where I had an event and that some people were meant to be there, but it turns out their information that they got, the guy that gave it to them should never have had it in the first place. And in that sort of situation, that made total sense to me that that entire bit of their involvement in said event, should have been voided, and that was okay because I agreed with that. And that made sense for the situation. The situation could have evolved to character death, and it could have evolved to injury. And in that sense, because of the certain things that actually came up through roleplay, the information came up through roleplay and was contested, it didn't make sense. There was a sort of gap in that just, it was illogical. So it had to be voided. In that case, I'd say yes.
So somebody had been metagaming there?
I wouldn't say, well, maybe by accident, maybe on purpose, who knows? But to me, I think it's more accidental. It just happened, and in that sort of situation, it was cut off, and that was voided. And I think that's a good time for when things should be voided, because it leads to consequences that shouldn't have happened in the first place. As for our Darth in the cantina, for me, I wouldn't say that that's enough to cause a void, because I, as I said, you're on the more story side of things, I'm on the more realism side. I'd still go in and roll with the punches, as it were, and see where essentially roleplay took us.
Oh, I'd do that too. definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Unless, he was that random PvE guy. If he's a cool role player, I'd totally roll with it, But I don't think that situation would realistically end in death for either party, though. But if he suddenly starts to sort of try and emote and insist that your character's dead, which I don't think roleplay, trying to kill somebody in a cantina fight all of a sudden generally isn't really it generally isn't a good thing. But I don't think that would really happen in that situation. I think you might, punch each other a bit, and that's that.
It's I mean, like, for example, Zash and Thanaton, that Inquisitor storyline, very public deaths are often treated with a lot of anger and threats, I suppose. Thanaton in that situation was really damning of Zash, even though she came out with that Darth title, which was I suppose a positive for her. It gives us an example of a situation where that sort of thing, that sort of behavior, public death of another Sith, is quite a strange one. Of course, you can't stop it, and I suppose at the end of the day, in the community, it's going to be very hard to have a sort of Inquisitor that can come along and take you away. I mean, no one's really that interested. So it's one of those sort of situations where
don't underestimate people. Like, the Inquisitors will try.
As in the Inquisitor role players, or are we talking?
Some of them anyway.
Yeah, they'll come out from the woodworks and just demand your arrest.
Nobody expects the Inquisition.
Yeah.
Okay. But so you say, but you keep answering in case of what you think in your own case.
Mm-hmm.
But would you condemn somebody who decided to avoid a random murder attack or something they hadn't conceded to?
I wouldn't.
I think was more of my question.
No, I wouldn't. To be straight and narrow with it, I wouldn't, because it's their role play. As long as it doesn't affect me, then they do as they wish. I wouldn't condemn someone else. I think at the end of the day, we're all we've all got to have a bit of common sense and do what we think is right for ourselves. But I'm neither pro nor against someone deciding to avoid it if they think it's rational. If it affects me and they want to avoid something that I personally don't think makes sense, then obviously I'll fight against that and I will argue my point in case. It's about finding that common ground for me. But that's my stance on it.
So, to summarize, communication, always communicate, preferably always communicate before you try and pursue another character's death. And through that communication, establish a common premise to ensure that you're sort of on the same level playing field.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's very key.
And then I'd add there that unless you really know each other well, I'd say that keep communicating a bit out of character on occasion, because it's likely to make both parties more comfortable, and it can get uncomfortable in cases such as this, which is when emotion starts flowing. They'll usually start flowing no matter what when a character dies. I mean, unless it's a throwaway character.
Of course.
Then we also had the topic of revival. Now, this is a bit of a tricky topic in all role-playing communities, but more so in Star Wars than some. For instance, we know for a fact that in, for instance, the Warcraft universe, revival is a thing. In various forms. It's rare, but it's a thing. It can happen. It's a bit more controversial in Star Wars, although it needs to be established that lore indicates that it can happen, but it's very rare, and the lore sources I'm talking about here is specifically in the Jedi Academy game. You have the cultists of Mark Arachnus using his scepter to gather force power, which they then want to give to the spirit of Mark Arachnus so that he can sort of regenerate his body. And the other example of that is in the Tales of the Jedi comics, when Freedan Nad sort of mentors, the spirit of Freedan Nad mentors Exar Kun, and with the goal in mind, he reveals later that he wants Exar Kun to use Sith alchemy to create a new body for him that he can then possess and come back to life. But it's a very vague thing here. But it's sort of possible. But it's a very iffy topic. What do you think about character revival?
Oh yeah, I definitely agree. It's an iffy topic. It's a tough one to talk about, because what's the point of having consequences? If there is an option to just simply revive, it does take away that fear that I suppose makes our characters humane, in the sense of that they are actual living and breathing. They have fears, they have wants. I think for me, it's not something that I'm personally interested in, but I wouldn't condemn, or I wouldn't essentially, call someone a bad role player if they try to do it.
Oh, can I push you there?
Of course.
You're saying it removes fear. Do you think that a good role player can't reflect fear of death in their character, despite knowing that they don't want their character to die now, or the characters could potentially be brought back?
I think that in situations where someone doesn't truly believe that their character can die, it is often hard to represent that. I mean, people can do it, like obviously in roleplay you are able to do that, but a lot of the time I've noticed, at least, that sometimes with other characters, when they don't have that fear, when someone doesn't understand that a character is a finite thing, and not just something that you do come home, it's like a random avatar, it can lead to them to do things that a character might not usually do if they actually were afraid. For example, an acolyte that suddenly goes, you know what, you stupid alien, I'm not going to listen to you. What acolyte in their right mind would ever say that if they actually were, afraid of the Sith? We see a bit of back-talking in, our Star Wars main characters, the Warrior storyline, the Inquisitor storyline. But in an actuality where a character isn't that protagonist, the realism is that if a Sith Lord walks in with red eyes and a lightsaber on their belt, you're not going to call him a stupid alien. It doesn't make sense. It's illogical. And then when the guy takes out his lightsaber in preparation to kill you, you don't start still chatting back to them. It's in that sort of situation, it is clear to me that someone doesn't have that fear of character repercussions, possible character death, and then you can't really do much about them. It kind of ruins the sort of immersion. And I think that the possibility, at least from my I suppose interaction with people both on WoW and on Star Wars, that it has been very key that that has taken it away.
Well, in that case, and I've definitely encountered that too, I think that's more of just a bad role player or an inexperienced role player. I agree that if you have this sense that you might die, it can definitely add more to the motivation, but I think that an experienced role player can definitely role play fear. I've seen it done well. I've done it well myself, I think, in several situations, and role play realistically anyway. You can teach that, so I don't think that's necessarily true, but I get where you're coming from.
Yeah.
But in that case, like what you use there, which I think is also a bit of an exaggerated example, it's definitely just a bad role player or an inexperienced role player.
I do agree. Normally that is a bad role player trait, but I have seen an experienced role player do that. It's not something I'd consider just located to a bad role player. I've experienced good role players who emote well, who do that well, but there is the one thing that is lacking in their entire thing is this fact that they don't fear consequences, because consequences don't exist to them. It's not isolated, I don't think, but that's me personally.
Yeah. Well, I think that also comes a bit down to what do you call it? Well, it's sort of a more subtle guard emoting, I would call it, because there is some players who realize that you can't hurt my character without me giving the consent to do so.
Yeah.
Who takes like that trope and reverses it, and then consciously uses it to their own advantage.
Yeah.
And of course, I mean, it's a nuanced thing. In some cases, specifically in this setting, we do also have some disagreements of what constitutes where's the line, what's the fine borders of the law where you trigger something, when would something be discovered, or who is more powerful, and so on, which is into entirely different topics.
Yeah.
But for instance, with the acolyte there, and in front of a lord, then we had one of those in Hands of Darkness back when I played in that guild, where we had a guy who would do that constantly. And if I had, you know, I was just a sub-officer back then, but if I had been the guild leader back then, I would have removed him from the guild after, if he didn't change after a stern talking to, because I view that as sort of god emoting.
It is. It is to a certain degree. Yeah, it's you're essentially making yourself godlike in a situation. You avoid the consequences, and that is, I suppose, one of the main things about being god.
But to stay a bit on the revival topic, I've actually done one of these revival rituals in my roleplay.
Oh.
But that wasn't exactly a case of dodging consequence. It was more tied to a story, because what happened there is there was this role-playing character that my character knew back in Hands of Darkness days, and we sort of parted way for 2 years until she ended up joining my guild. I don't know, around 2 to 3 years, and she then ended up joining my guild on another character. And we talked about it could be really cool if our characters could interact again, because he was like one of Iradox's original apprentices when he was just a lord. At this point, he was very much into sort of Force mysticism. I figured, well, he could try this, and we could see whether it would sort of work, because the characters who knew her characters weren't really around anymore, and her character didn't really die as a result of somebody scheming against us, so you didn't really remove an achievement from anyone. It was more a case of she died at the conclusion of a storyline because her character was dying anyway, because she was sort of sick and her body was dying due to something in another storyline. So we decided that we could probably get a lot of fun roleplay if it was actually possible to bring this character back. So we set out to create like a big plot around it, where we went to different sorcerers from different guilds. We actually even had briefly had one of your sorcerers involved, and we set up a big ritual and wrote it up, and then we involved 5 of the more prominent sorcerers like on the server at the time that I could find, and then we set up an event and we did this ritual thing, which then worked in character, and we role played for a bit, but then she sort of went inactive again, and I don't really know what happened to that character, but I've sort of concluded, in my own mind that, well, the body probably couldn't last with the spirit, and she sort of died again.
Yeah. See, that's what I would have said would have been an interesting one. I think it would have been really interesting if it kind of almost had a Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood sort of approach, where you'd gone all to this trouble to kind of deal with it and all the pain and suffering and everything like that. And you tried it and you attempted it, and it actually like brought them back, but only for a short space of time, and their body started to essentially decompose and couldn't handle the soul, and it just ended up breaking down anyway. So that short respite of that time, was it worth this, the second emotional struggle and pain of it all? I mean, that's interesting stuff right there.
Well, I don't think my character feel that it was, but it was definitely interesting roleplay. And I think it was fun with the people involved, which I think is ultimately the key. I think revival done poorly would be a case of you have a big plot against somebody, let's say one of the people you schemed against, where you had sort of agreed on the premise, and you ended up winning, killing his character, and then in a month or a couple of days, as has been seen in our community at some point, he has done an essence transfer despite being dead, and now he's back.
Yeah. So Darth Sidious 2.0.
Pretty much, yes. That'd be bad, I think.
Yeah.
So you can do it well depending on the circumstances.
Yeah, for sure.
I feel. Then there's also more like soft revivals, which would be something like a Force Ghost or a Holocron Gatekeeper.
Yeah. I think that's quite cool, because I already roleplay. I have that in my roleplay already, and I think it's a really interesting dynamic. For someone that already has a dead character, they come back for these small respites where the information that they've had before is passed on through a holocron or a Force Ghost, for example. I think it adds a different weight to something that you've already played. It adds a different dynamic to a character you've maybe played for 2 years, 3 years, 1 year, 6 months. It's an interesting one to deal with the fact that they might be dead, in the sense that their spirit has left, whatever, they've joined the Force or whatever. But they now are able to experience this through a different way. What personality does the Gatekeeper have? What does the spirit think in comparison to what they thought in life? Example, Darth Maul. I mean, thinks completely differently than what he did in life. So
yeah. I think that those are really good too, and allows for some interesting dynamics. Of course, I mean, if you're going to use holocrons or Sith spirits or Force Ghosts, I'd advise you to look up the lore about it, because there are some very specific rules involved. And, of course you can do whatever you like when you roleplay. There's nobody who can really be the judge of you except your immediate roleplaying group. But I've seen, acolytes roleplay, and then one acolyte who hadn't really mastered the Force at all came back as a Sith spirit, and in which case I'm just like, no, that wouldn't work, because a Sith spirit needs a lot of power to sort of vest themselves, and they need the knowledge, and they need an anchor, and so on, which gives a lot of reasons why it wouldn't work.
Yeah.
And at the same time, just building a holocron off screen is a bit of an iffy for me, because a Sith holocron is something it's difficult for a Sith master, and it takes a long time, and you really miss out on a role-playing opportunity if you don't go through the process of doing it.
Yeah.
Actually, the Star Wars role-playing tabletop core books also suggest that it's not so building a holocron should sort of be a side quest with specific components and roleplay and so on. So I understand that people might not want to sit and roleplay constructing it, but they could always roleplay getting the parts and finding the knowledge and so on. And then I remember when my character built his, there was a specific day where he wasn't very happy, because he just spent 2 weeks on trying to gather this holocron, and he made one tiny mistake and the entire thing just crumbled, and she's like, "Argh!" Then he had to try again.
I did enjoy that part of the Darth Bane books, as an aside, on the whole holocron front. I think it's a great way to transition yourself from character death onto another plane if you want to. You could have your new main if you wanted to continue role playing, as in an actual living being, and you can have this other character that will provide a respite, but also a sort of sense of nostalgia. I think it's a nice way of sort of getting yourself over it all, as it's a difficult situation dealing with the death of a character you might have played for a long time.
Yeah, and a nice way of role-playing a holocron Gatekeeper would be, for instance, a Discord RP session where you can just role-play your Gatekeeper, I find. Because you can, of course, write it sort of like journal entries. I got one of those where you sort of just write your character's thoughts on different things, but that becomes a bit stale, because it becomes sort of a recording, and I feel the Sith holocron ought to be this interactive object people should be able to find and talk to, like they're talking to the person.
Yeah, for sure. I do agree. Yeah. I think that's a really key point. It should be like that.
You can use it as a journal too, because what can you do? It's not always you have somebody to roleplay your Gatekeeper with. But I find that works really well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for certain.
Okay, moving on then to the last topic, which is personal experience. Do you have any personal experiences with character deaths? And if so, could you share some of them with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a fair few personal experiences on WoW. I won't go too into depth of that. On Star Wars, I've seen a lot of character death. I haven't had I've had a character in Star Wars die, but it was a long time ago. In terms of personal experience in a Star Wars setting, I've had a lot of people attempt character death. So I'm very much aware of that. But as for character death, there was a situation as one of my acolyte characters, in Fabled Trials, where trials essentially go wrong, and in this case it went very wrong for one of these characters who got tricked into doing the worst things possible. And in that situation, there was a lot of escalation. There was a lot of issues between, one of the pure-blooded characters versus this human character. And they were in a situation where we'd just beaten everything, but this character was on its last legs. It was in a bad state. It had been roughed up by machinery, by walkers and such, which was, the consequences of some of the actions that our characters took during this trial. And so the other character, enraged by their existence, literally walked up to it and just killed him. And as it happens, and the character was drifted off into the river, never to be seen again. And in those sort of situations, it's a tough thing, because I wanted to, I'm not super into doing it myself, but in that sort of situation, I wanted to almost help him, even though my character wouldn't. But that's a sort of a feeling that you have to bite down. And it's in those sort of situations that you kind of know and realize that you have no other choice. There is an impossible force that you just can't fight against in that, similar to our previous example of the 5 people that encroach you in a corner with their lightsabers drawn. It's a hard thing to suddenly, suddenly my limbs work, and you kind of dodge out of that. I think that's one that's key in my mind.
And that was that a player killing another player?
It was, yeah.
Yeah, and but from what I gathered there, that was sort of a guild trial program, right?
It was, yeah.
Acolyte program, yeah. And I imagine that program, you had sort of, when you created the acolytes in the guild, you had already sort of given your consent to death might happen. Yeah. It might be part of it, right? It's
how it works. Or this was back when things were a lot harsher. Now escalation certainly happens much quicker for acolytes because of the way things work. Another example of it is an alien character that was acting too bravado in a very pureblood dominant trial period, and they kept doing stuff that was out of complete bounds, and they just and it got to a point where people were saying, can we have escalation? And it just kept increasing until the point where a dagger was drawn, and that alien, after a scuffle, ended up dead. And that's how it kind of works. And I think people do realize that acolyte lives are very much on the line, and they do respect the consequences of that. But it's not something that that it's automatically part of the consent, or at least isn't now.
Well, yeah, I definitely recognize that. I think a lot of that lies in the fact that when people create characters specifically to get the acolyte experience, they also sort of accept the consequences that come with it. Unless, for instance, we ran 3 successful acolyte batches that lasted like a couple of months each. Like one of them lasted like half a year before they actually became Sith back in my guild, the Directive. And we made it pretty clear that if you create an acolyte character, be that an alt or your main in our guild, there's a risk of death, because we want that included here. So make your character or join in your character knowing that this is a risk.
Yeah. Which
sort of created the playing field already. And there was deaths. I mean, they died, a lot of them. And a few survived, and then they felt like they had really accomplished something, so that sort of simulated that experience. But I think it's easier to kill off acolyte characters. I mean, I made a few actually just to die, because I wanted to, me and some other storytellers and officers, because we wanted to create the immersive feeling, right?
Yeah.
And provide that. But it's also, when you create a character on that premise, you sort of know what you're getting into.
Yeah.
I think where character deaths, in my experience, get more difficult is when it's with characters that's been around for a while, or who don't really just see it coming.
Yes.
And I've had experiences both with my own characters dying and killing other characters, which I actually really don't like to do. I severely hate it, because I feel like I'm cutting out somebody else's story. I know some people really enjoy killing other people's characters because they feel like this OOC power rush, although people usually don't want to admit it. But I've talked to some people who actually feel that way.
Yeah.
I don't like it.
I agree. I don't like it either.
Yeah, no. But sometimes you are in a situation where like when, for instance, if you play a Sith Lord, especially if you play like a Darth, you sometimes find yourself in a situation where it just doesn't make sense for your character not to kill somebody. And in those situations, I've sort of told that to the other party, and then I've been like, right, we can, what do you think we should do? I suggest we can do this if you're cool with it, which is this is what my character would do. We can arrange for your character to escape if you like, but then depending on how plausible it would be and so on, which you then discuss. Or if you really don't want that, we can try this and this and this. And then we sort of worked out a solution together and sort of executed it.
Yeah. I think that's a really good way, as we've said continuously, communication.
Yeah.
But
I don't think it can be repeated enough.
No, exactly. If anything, it needs to be said more. But I think that's key. I think really key to kind of talk to them about it. But I think also another thing is maybe finding a solution through the roleplay as well. Like as long as it's plausible, yeah. I mean, if this guy's like completely backed off, jumped through a window, may have cut himself severely in this thing, but he's like falling down this path and lands on a speeder through the force and whatnot, and manages to get away that way, I'd be like, that's fair enough.
Oh yeah, that's the case where you try to really find a solution because the character really wouldn't die. Then you try and find a compromise, and maybe sometimes it's implausible, but roll with it anyway, because that's what you do. It's sort of the responsibility of role-playing with others, especially if you role-play a character who is powerful and who's generally accepted as powerful.
Yeah.
I've also had characters die. I had one character who was sort of a main in one guild, but they wanted me to bring in an officer character, and in that guild, sort of the leading position and the what's it called? The OC position, OC and in character leading position was tied together for some reason. So my other main character, ended up sort of getting possessed by a spirit or an entity, which then sort of ran amok and did some bad stuff. And it was meant to sort of get her free and then punish her for what she was doing, but not really kill off the character. But because it ended up dragging out, she ended up running around with this powerful spirit, insane spirit inside of her for like more than half a year.
Wow.
And so I ended up concluding that it wouldn't make sense for her to survive because her body was sustained to so much dark side corruption that the moment the spirit was gone, she just sort of fell down. Also because when people had to fight her, it was you couldn't really. It didn't make sense for her to survive. So that's probably the most meaningful character death I've experienced, which was sort of satisfying in its own way because it was this story conclusion.
Yeah.
But in this case, the character sort of went from a character to an NPC.
Yeah.
I've also had a very random character death, which was with one of my alts, fairly new alts, so I didn't really, it didn't bother me so much. But that was my young Merillian alien who offended two Sith Lords not on purpose, and they just killed him. Very brutally. And I was left a bit with a feeling of, okay, well, whatever, So...
Yeah. I think that highlights something quite interesting there. It's, as we were saying, it's like time. If you haven't got that much time and you're kind of like, he offended them. I didn't mean to offend them, but you know what? It's happened. Oh, he's dead. You're kind of like, oh, okay, well, that's that then. That's cool.
Yeah.
I mean, hopefully that's a nice talking point for them, but, it's not something you care too much about.
Yeah, but because that's also time and investment, which then causes emotional attachment, right?
Yeah.
For instance, how long have you been playing your main character?
Yeah, well, it's over about a year and 2 months, I'd say now.
Yeah, and do you feel attached to him?
I like his story. I like role playing him. I'd be sad if he died, but to be honest, I'd probably have a lot more free time if he did.
Oh yeah, I know that feeling. Yeah. I've sort of role played mine for 6 years.
It's a long time.
Yeah, so it's and I've known people. I mean, I know a lot of people who've played their characters for a long time. You get really attached to a character over that while. So it'd be a big deal if something like that suddenly happened.
For certain.
But so to close off with like fun stories, I'm gonna tell a story where I did something with character death that it's not really a fun story, but I screwed up.
But you just said it's a fun story.
Well, I meant like a fun story to end off on, but really it's not.
Yeah.
But do you have a fun story too? Or am I going to out myself alone?
What, as in about character death?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a fun story.
Okay, well, so my story is back in a time in my guild where we had like a lot of in-character and also a bit of OC tension because we had some different ideas of where the guild would go. But generally we wanted a more severe tone in the guild where character deaths was more on the agenda, which we had sort of presented, right? Mm-hmm. So that there was this feeling of a risk. And we had this character who repeatedly messed up a lord in our guild, whom, well, her character was one of Iradox's adopted daughters. Mm-hmm. And I knew that for a fact this player did not want, she was attached to her character. She did not want her character to die, right? Mm-hmm. So I kept, sort of giving the character small chances in character and doing sort of minor punishments because I really didn't want to kill her character, Mm-hmm. But it ended up becoming this thing where all the other Civ Lords in the guild sort of started seeing Iradox as being weak, which wasn't good from an in-character perspective because he was their leader, because he couldn't properly punish his daughter.
Yeah.
So it started the fact that I had to continue to respect their out of character's wishes not to have their character killed. Ended up reflecting poorly on mine.
Yeah.
Well, it went on for a time, and I kept for OC reasons giving them more chances to sort of turn it around and prove themselves. Until it got to a point where it was just ridiculous. And to my defense, at this point, I was also in a lot of pressure from other fronts and really stressed. So I ended up making the mistake of just killing her character. And I messed up in that situation. And if she's listening, I apologize. I have apologized before. And I really regret that. That was really not done well. I should at least have told her first that, it's getting to a point. Well, I had already told her that it was getting to a point, but I should really have sat down and be like, Iradox is gonna try and kill your character now. If you don't want your character to die, what do we do?
Yeah.
And then given her a chance to escape, which I didn't in that case, which I should have. So I messed up in that situation and learned from it, I like to believe.
Yeah, that's the main thing. The main thing is learning from it. So shall I come in with my story now then?
Because now I feel bad. So come and feel bad with me.
It's I think mine's a little bit more amusing, the one that I'm thinking of. It's definitely led to some amusing topics, but essentially at some point there was an acolyte character that really, for some reason, was kind of being a bit of a snake all around the place, throwing their loyalties to different people. And at the time, I was an apprentice, and this acolyte essentially, had some serious information that, to be honest, we really didn't want getting out. But it just so happened that they were messaging another acolyte on Holocom at the same time that they were in, our estate. And we got to this point, and they were trying to convince this acolyte that was, essentially became the apprentice of Hirak's colleague. Was saying to him that the Calcorans, these guys, they're weak, they don't know anything, they're terrible. And one of the major lines is the sort of fact that the Calcorans have no allies, and it's become a big meme because of the fact that actually, they did. In realism, and that this character had no idea that actually they were on Holocom out loud to the two characters that they were, essentially saying had no allies, who then used said allies to have that character killed. Now, I don't like doing it, and this is one of the only times where I've actually actively pursued it, aside from another sort of PDA style thing. But it was quite amusing. It's become an amusing thing. Obviously, that did end with character death, and the person wasn't particularly happy about it. And I do feel bad about it. And if you are listening, I am sorry for that sort of situation. It was before our whole escalation thing, and I think we've all learned from that. But it was an interesting set of roleplay that was rather amusing.
So what would you have done differently?
In all honesty, I think the problem is, though, I don't think I probably would have done anything differently. I think apart from communication, I think communication would have been, I would have communicated more with the player. I still think the IC would have gone as it was, because it did get a bit ridiculous, as you mentioned before, in your story. But communication is something I would have done in the same way that you said, Iradox, that you wanted to have more communication with that person. I would have done the same.
Yeah, and then maybe giving them, if they really didn't want their character to die, there was always the chance of letting them escape or something.
The only issue I think both of our fronts is that with that situation,
they were sort of tied to the guild, and their roleplay was there. So even if you sort of gave them a chance to escape, it might sort of.
It would still spiral. That's the problem. There's so many consequences that should have happened one way, and things did work out for the best in terms of an icy situation. But you can't help.
Oh yeah, I mean, my friend whose character died also ended up making a new character, and so we still talk, and we still roleplayed for many years and so on together. We still roleplay now. But yeah, so I guess. Moral of the story, to summarize, is communicate, and even if you are like a realism player, a storyteller player, or something in between, keep in mind that your peers might not feel the same way. So unless you know somebody really well, always try and sort of communicate first, is what I'd say.
Yeah, it's the most important thing with character death.
And if you messed up once, as you can hear we have, you can still learn and improve. And remember that role-playing is about mutual fun together.
Mutual fun together. That's the tagline.
Yeah, mutual fun together. Okay, and on that very high and preaching note, that's the show. So we'll see you in another episode in another 2 months or something.
Take care.